Campside Media.
Hey, Campsite listeners. Welcome to Inside the Tent, our series where we go behind the microphone of our hit podcasts, old and new. I'm Josh Dean, one of the co-founders of Campside Media, and a voice you might recognize as the host of some of our shows. But today, I'm talking about a show I worked on as a producer during our first collaboration with Wondery, Germany. It's Campside's first show in German. And no, I do not speak German. But fortunately, our guest, Antonia Woloshyn, does. She's a German-born, American-educated journalist who lives in New York City, and the story that became the show, Land ohne Vater, premiering January 27th, is one she's been following for years. Land ohne Vater recounts one of the darkest chapters of Germany's recent past. It's the story of 9 connected murders, all but one of immigrant men who ran small businesses. Police assumed the men were mostly criminals themselves and that the murders had to be crime-related, which meant that for years the awful truth of the killings was buried. This was a coordinated effort by right-wing terrorists, and when the truth came to light, it sparked a firestorm in Germany, causing the country to grapple with exactly how much progress it's actually made against racism and far-right extremism. Antonia and I sit down to discuss this incredible story, the lessons it could teach us as Americans, and the challenges of producing a show that spans multiple time zones and languages. Here's our conversation. I hope you enjoy it. Antonia, we've been talking about this story a long time. So for someone who's hearing this and hasn't listened to the show yet, first of all, we were calling it Operation Confetti. It has a German name, and I will let you say that first. And then explain it to us in sort of the short version what it's about.
Yeah, it's about 2 women who lose their fathers in the most traumatic ways and discover bit by bit that something isn't right because the police start interviewing them like a day after their father is shot and like basically frame the families. And they know that their fathers are innocent and they realize that what happened with them was happening with 7 other families. And they realized that there was an intelligence agent present during one of the murders, and it goes on from then.
And they're Turkish, first-generation Turkish immigrant women, right?
Yeah.
And their fathers had immigrated, and so their fathers are murdered. So it seems on the surface, or at least at first, potentially a series of murders of immigrants that might have something to do with organized crime. Or at least this is the story that's put forward by the media and the police, is that, oh, they must have been up to something, right? When in fact, it turns out it was a plot, and it was directly anti-immigrant violence organized and perpetrated by a right-wing movement, right? And what's the title we ended up with?
Land ohne Vater, which is a play on fatherland, which is a very German word. And I think that works really well. Yeah, so it's a country without father. That's kind of what it means.
And so this is quite a famous story in Germany. It takes place. What are the years we're talking about?
They go underground in 1998. Before that, our police officers already investigating them. It's 2 men and a woman. And the first murder starts in 2000. The murders end in 2007. And the men, the 2 neo-Nazi terrorists, commit suicide in 2011.
So more than a decade, the story is going on.
Yeah.
And so you've been thinking about this for a long time, because I feel like it was 5 years ago when we first talked about it. Why, it's a famous story in Germany, obviously not well known at all in America. Why were you interested in it?
I've always been interested in the question of complicity in Germany. I think that's something, we really looked at our past, I think culturally, more than you guys have, maybe up until 2020. But I think what we kind of overlooked is how much Germans knew. We had just below 24,000 camps in Germany.
Concentration camps, you mean?
Yeah. And to the point that in Nuremberg there was a camp right next to a public pool. But still Germans like to think of themselves more as liberated than that fact that we capitulated. So I think that was always something I was interested in. And I found it interesting in this story how, yes, it's dealt with in depth in Germany. Well, I don't know if it's dealt with in depth. It's been dealt with a lot. But I think some of the analysis is a little short-sighted, what we're seeing in the U.S. as well. I personally think, and I think that's sort of where we end with in the show, that we overlooked this for so long because we had this pledge that we overcame the past. And I think that's why it was like burning under my fingertips to say that, because I felt so frustrated with the hypocrisy in a way. And I mean, I feel like the story needs to be told in the US as well, just because there's so many similarities.
Well, it's the story that Germans tell themselves, it seems, is that this horrible thing happened. This, terrible man rose up in the 1930s and whipped up a fever, and Germany turned into the worst place in the world and perpetrated this incredible atrocity. And yet came out the other side and was like, we will never let that happen again, right? That we're not apologizing for it. Anyone who took part in it, shall be sort of scorned forever, but yet we learned from it, right? And the reality is the right wing is alive and well, including things that resemble the Nazi Party or modern-day Nazi Party, right? And is it that a lot of people just choose not to see it or don't want to see it, or?
I think now we're at a point where we can't not talk about it. But we have elections in February, and they're at around 21% estimated. The second strongest party, the AfD, Elon Musk just
I saw that.
You did? Oh, my God. It was so awkward.
So they're basically fully out in the open again, and a growing number of people are supporting a right wing that's not apologetic about its feelings about immigrants and minorities.
Yeah. And I think it's similar to some secret Trump voters. They vote along economic lines or whatever, and they just choose to overlook that.
Even though a lot of them probably behind closed doors agree with some of the worst rhetoric, right?
Yeah.
Which is that, they don't want immigrants, or they blame them for the things that are going. I mean, and certainly that's the parallel to here, is that, we're a country that also feels like it dealt with its demons. And yet here we are again, where we're reversing policies, and people in the South especially, but all over the country, are saying things like, I don't want my kids to feel bad for being white, which is not actually what they mean. No one is making you feel bad for being white, but you should feel bad about the things that happened in the past and help make sure they don't happen again, right? And what this story is the worst manifestation of it, which is people get so upset about immigrants or minorities or whatever that they commit acts of violence, right?
Yeah.
What do you think the three terrorists here wanted to accomplish? What was the point of it?
I think that's something Mehmet said, the human rights lawyer. He thought that it was an interesting timing because just as they started to murder, that generation of the children of guest workers and the guest workers themselves, so like Mehmet and his parents, got German citizenship. And I do think that's a really good point. Right around that time, they start murdering successful men, business owners. So I think it was a sign, don't feel too comfortable.
And was it treated like an isolated event, or do you think there was a portion of the German population that even supported the actions? I mean, obviously we'll talk a little bit about the outright cover-up by the police and intelligence agencies. But do you think in certain portions of the public, this form of extreme, anti-immigrant, I guess, violence is the ultimate extreme, but that making them feel uncomfortable was a not unpopular sentiment?
Of course, we don't know, but I wouldn't be that surprised because I think we talk about this in the 5th episode. Then this social democrat politician wrote a book where he claimed that, he made some awful racist claims and anti-immigrant claims, and it was on the bestseller list for 21 weeks. So I think that says quite a lot about how receptive Germans were to his theories.
And then on a government level, the investigation was at best completely botched and at worst intentionally sabotaged. Why would the government not want to get to the bottom of this?
That's a really interesting question. And I think in terms of the police, I think it was genuine institutional racism, as in just a big fat blind spot. There was one police officer who, I think he was pretty much the only one, who saw things clearly. In terms of the intelligence service, I think that was a deliberate situation. They completely had them on their radar. They were surveilling them for a long time, that whole group. They had so many informants in that group. And then when it came down to it, suddenly they didn't have any information. Well, why did they destroy records?
Yeah, which our original title, Operation Confetti, is related to an incident where, was it thousands of pages of records were destroyed overnight?
Yes, I don't know the exact number of pages, but basically all the records of the relevant informers were destroyed.
Intentionally by the order of a high-ranking intelligence officer, right?
Mm-hmm.
But this all comes out later. So when the story breaks, it's not just the story of these 9 murders by right-wing terrorists. It's that there was a cover-up, and beyond the cover-up, that there was like an attempt from very high up to bury the investigation, or at least to make it seem like, they didn't know what was going on, when very clearly at least some people did, right?
Yeah.
And what was the public's reaction to that part of it? That like, holy shit, the government knew this was happening and chose not to say anything, and not just that, but try and bury its involvement with the right wing?
I think it was the beginning of an awareness and a movement, definitely, but it wasn't like a huge outcry. Like in Belgium, I remember with the Marc Dutroux case, which was also like about institutional corruption, basically, thousands of people marched pretty much on a regular basis. I think in Germany, because we have 16 states and 16 police agencies, 16 intelligence agencies, people just said, it's just they didn't work together. They didn't communicate. That's, as our NSU expert Dirk Laab says, that's bullshit. The court case was designed, I feel like, to, I want to say, grind people down. It took a really long time.
Really long time? Like,
yeah.
How long?
5 years.
5 years.
Yeah.
Every day?
I think they had like a summer break of a couple of weeks, but
wow,
pretty much very consistent, yeah.
Which is almost guaranteed to make people get tired of it. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think that was the point, probably. I mean, maybe they were trying to be very thorough.
Yeah.
Did anyone go to prison other than the woman, Beate?
Yeah, it was 5 people in total, but not for a very long time. One of them was let go the day of the verdict, and like all the neo-Nazis on stand were cheering. But I think back to your question about were Germans getting upset at the institutional corruption part, I think Dirk Laab, our NSU expert, who's a journalist and wrote like the earliest, most comprehensive book about it, said basically if this would have happened in the US, we would have investigated it further and looked at the institutional corruption. Germans are a little bit more reserved when it comes to that, and he thinks it's to do with our past and, that intellectual core being eradicated in World War II, and that we had to relearn, and it's still quite slow. And I think there's more investigative journalism now, but I think when the story came out, we would have really benefited from people looking at it much more closely.
Is there any sense now that, like you said, the AfD is doing really well? In certain states, I think the right wing is very popular, right? Like it's very similar to the U.S. in that sense, I assume, which is certain provinces, probably the more rural ones, the more working class, the right wing is rising in popularity, right?
Yeah.
Which in some sense relates to economic struggles and like all the same things that are happening here in the U.S., which is the areas where the right wing is most popular were traditionally in the U.S. heavily Democratic strongholds, but that's when the working class was doing well, and it was easy to make a living anywhere in America. And a lot of the things that get blamed for the sort of death of rural America or the struggles of the working class are globalization and immigration. And the thing that you point to are the people who were here now who weren't there before, right? But of course, before it wasn't Mexicans and Venezuelans, it was the Irish and the Italians, right? Mm-hmm. It's always somebody else.
Of course.
It's never your fault. It's never just progress. And whether progress is good or bad, the world changes and you have to adapt to it. And bad people take advantage of that, right?
I think the 2008 financial crisis didn't help.
Right, exactly. And I think it's sort of the one thing after another. And what happens is that people rise up and exploit that. And I mean, we're seeing it here too. You've got a unique perspective because you're German but have lived in the U.S. now for how long?
Like 4 years, and I lived here a year before, so it'll be around 5.
I mean, do you see similarities between the two countries?
Definitely. And when I was doing a master, Charlottesville had just happened. And I was like pretty blown away by the fact how similar it felt. Like we were soul searching, but it was also slightly awkward because there were so many warning signs, like the Oklahoma bombing and the Charleston church shooting. But we were also in the US and Germany. I think it was like a real wake-up moment, but it felt slightly awkward in a way. Yeah, I think it's interesting because we feel like we dealt with it culturally more. Like I said earlier, we have our limitations. But at that point, that was 3 years before 2020, you hadn't. I mean, I think this was more of a black box than it was for us. But what I found pretty shocking in a way at the time was that, and of course that's still the case today, that so many plantations, like people have their weddings there, it's like their hotels. And when you do go to a tour, which I've done a couple of times because I'm interested in how slavery would be dealt with during the tours, it's often like a side note. But in Germany, we're so aware of the biggest concentration camps, and like we like to think of guilt like only as a subset of people we like to see as perpetrators. But, you know, so I think it's interesting. There's so many. And then, of course, you know, we were both so focused on the war on terror and overlooked far-right extremism. And, you know, now Elon Musk endorsing our far-right party, like, it scares me a little bit.
I mean, yeah, look at what his money did here, right? And now he's meddling in England, too. I mean, you know, the reality is the entire West has to worry about this, right? England's dealing with it. France is dealing with it. Scandinavia is dealing with it.
Yeah.
I mean, and then Eastern Europe is rapidly sliding backwards, right? So it's a scary moment, you know, when it feels like we had all made so much progress. I mean, in Germany, I think you guys, there was so much widespread public self-flagellation, including like there's words you're not allowed to use, right? Like it's like very much tried to like legislate and govern your way out of it, right? This will never happen again and you can't even use these words, right?
Exactly. While at the same time, I mean, we didn't really denazify. That's the story we like to tell, but our institutions and also the intelligence agencies weren't really denazified, and that had a knock-on effect, of course.
True here, too. I mean, the police forces are some of the most concentrated groups of racists in the country. I mean, not to paint with a broad brush, there's plenty of good cops, and I think lots of people who are trying to fix that. But the reality is, and I think especially in this era where you've got Trump and all the people under him who are really like raising cops up as like heroes all the time, but it's sort of like a wink, wink, nudge, nudge. We know you're on our side, right? You know, you also don't like immigrants, and you also think liberals are here to destroy the country, right?
Yeah.
It's just never been so open and outright in my lifetime where, you know, people in power are willing to fan the flames of this real ugliness that leads to violence. I mean, yeah, like we talk about these 9 murders in Germany. You could point to 10 different incidents that have happened here, Oklahoma City to, like you said, the Charleston shooting where more than 9 people were shot in one time. I guess in a lot of cases, the story we tell ourselves is, oh, those are just lone wolf, like isolated incidents. It was just this one crazy person. And if only we had better mental health or like gun control. But the ideas come from somewhere. I mean, Ewan, our engineer here is from New Zealand, which is like mostly an idyllic place. But there was one very terrible mass shooting in New Zealand, right? Also driven by right-wing hate.
Yeah.
New Zealand did something about it, and nothing has happened since then. I feel like it's getting worse here.
Yeah. And I don't like, of course, then we can, because it's a global trend, I think our politicians make excuses. Like in Germany, they blamed it on the migrant crisis, and here they blamed it on Trump. But I think Trump is, you know, is a symptom, not the cause. And
well, he couldn't win an election twice if he were the call. I just think like he tapped into something that was here. And yeah, you're seeing it, like you said, the second most popular party now in Germany. And well, I don't want to talk all about the bad people, because I think what this show does really well is that we always try and be responsible about projects we do here, in the sense that we're not making bad people into heroes and we're not trying to linger on the darkness. And your story mostly is told through these 2 women who lived through one of the worst things that can happen to you and are willing to do something good with that, right? Like, why do you think they were willing to talk to you to the extent that they did?
I think that was all to do with Mehmet, who's this human rights lawyer who was like the representative of the plaintiff. And I think they became friends. And I think Semiya and Gamze were at a point where like they told that story 1,000 times. And Semiya was, reluctant to go through this again because it's so like they get a little re-traumatized every time they tell it. It's so emotional. And then what? You tell it again and then like you have to suffer for the next 3 days. Like what's the point? I completely understood it. But I wrote them like super long emails, and I think Mehmet made it clear that we were going to have a slightly different perspective. And then it was amazing to go to Turkey to visit Semiya and Gamze in Dortmund and, get to know their families and stuff.
I don't think it spoils anything by saying that, we tell the story through these two women, and in the end, they're both faced with the same choice, which is, do I stay and try and make a life in this place that's not what I thought it was, or do I go back to where I came from, right?
Yeah.
And they choose two different paths, right?
Yeah.
So which one, who stays and who goes? And just quickly, do you think you know why?
I think there was an interesting moment in 2011 when this whole thing came out. Gamze felt relieved because her family's honor, as she says, was like, reinstalled, and people knew that her father wasn't a bad person. But Semiya didn't feel any relief. She just felt like this huge sense of loss, like a second loss, because she realized that how many people in this country didn't want her, how they didn't see her as German. And she wasn't welcome, and I don't think she ever got over that. She still carries this huge sense of loss inside of her.
Did they both feel like they made the right decision? Because you're now talking to them more than a decade after they've made that decision, right? Do you think they both felt like they made the right call, or is either of them regretting it at all?
Gamze isn't at all. She's a political educator. She says Germany's my home. It's never going to change. She has this really powerful monologue at the top of the show. But I think Semiya is a little conflicted. Germany is still home. She goes there regularly. She can imagine going back, but she can't really. I think she says it's like a matter of the heart, but she doesn't know what the future holds.
I want to ask, this is the first show we've made in German. Obviously, that's possible because you speak both languages fluently. But do you want to quickly explain how we did it? Just sort of logistically, how did an American company where most people speak only English or English in languages that are not German, and you, a bilingual German-English speaker, like how did we actually make a podcast that will be released in German in Germany?
I know, it was kind of insane. In the beginning, I felt like we were all English when we were talking about the structure and the ideas. And then we started writing it in English and then had to translate it. And that's when we kind of lost you and Ashley Ann a little bit. I think we translated it like word for word to make sure that we wouldn't change any of it. But it was a strange process. Write it in English, translate it into German.
We did. We basically produced it in English for 75% of the way, right?
Probably a lot more than 75%.
Right. 85% probably, right? So Vanessa, the producer, who also is a bilingual English-German speaker who worked very closely with Antonia. The two of them worked with us, myself and Ashley and Krigbong primarily, in English. Yeah, so we basically produced the show in English up until the point where we needed to start, tracking, obviously, your narration, and then, obviously, the sound design and music. I think we were listening to English dry mixes, but there wasn't sound design until it was in German, right?
There wasn't sound design until it was in German, yeah.
But by that point, we had nailed the structure. We had been able to talk. And so that really is how we, in Wondery, to their credit, supported us in this. Because I felt like it would be harder than it was because I thought we'd be doing more of, the scripts are going to be in German and we're just going to have to talk about the ideas and I won't be able to read the scripts. But Wondery was like, no, we want you to make this in English because we want you guys to contribute. So yeah, you and Vanessa and Ashley Ann and I were able to go through multiple rounds of the scripts in English, along with the Wondery team in Germany, Patrick primarily. And so we felt like by the time you shifted to German, I don't know if you felt this way, the story was pretty locked, right?
The story was definitely locked. But it's English is so much more conversational and easy, and then it just suddenly felt very formal. Obviously going back to German. But I'm curious how that compared to working on The Evaporated for you.
Well, that we did English from start to finish, but like obviously large passage interviews would be in Japanese. That was a show we made in Japan. It was sort of the opposite at times because we would have to have the interviews translated from Japanese into English so that we could script in English, and then the show came out in English. But obviously I couldn't listen to the raw interviews. And then we had to have voice actors to come in to voice, which we didn't have to do here because we let the German tape be German. If we were to adapt this into English someday, we'd have to talk about which sources speak English, in which case we'd have to re-interview them, and which do not speak English, therefore we'll have to dub over them, which is what we did in Japan. We just used Japanese voice actors to speak over the top. And you realize pretty quickly it's not as easy as it seems because people inevitably sound like they're acting. If you were reading someone else's German words to me in English and they weren't your words, they're not your words. So you don't really know where the intonation falls, and you're not sure what part was the person. When were they happy and when were they sad and when were they angry? And then therefore it all sounds a little bit like, I don't know if this is authentic or not. So I'm always curious when someone hears it. That's not really what I sound like, is it? Right? Yeah. But in this case, I think it worked. We did English all the way until we couldn't anymore. And then, there was a point at which Ashley and I couldn't really be helpful, at least in terms of line edits. And I remember in the tracking in German, you guys had back and forth because German is just a very different language than English, right? Mm-hmm. And they wanted you to be a little more formal than you would have been naturally.
Yeah, they wanted to iron out my accent. I have a slight southern accent.
Do you?
Yeah. Ever so slight. I think if I don't know, 15 Germans were asked, like, where's she from? I don't think necessarily you'd be able to tell, but I have a slight. Also, I had to enunciate and stuff like that, which I guess you guys don't do here. And I think it's probably better not to do it because it makes you be able to focus more on what you're saying than how you're saying it.
But was it, in the end, did you find that other than like your intonation and your enunciation, were the changes made from English to German pretty small?
In terms of the writing?
Yeah, or like the words that ultimately end up in the podcast as it's...
Yeah, pretty much. They're pretty much the same, yeah. But we also made sure that the translation was as close as it could be to the English because you guys had worked so closely with us that we didn't feel comfortable making any changes. Of course, we had to in the end, and we went through another couple of rounds with Patrick, but...
It was pretty small at that point. And we I should say we also used a German-speaking sound designer, which I guess we didn't have to do, but I felt like is pretty important. I mean, we have a sound designer in the other room here. Ewan, is it hard? Would it be hard to sound design something that you couldn't understand the words of?
Absolutely. 100%.
That's what I thought. Yeah. So I think it's pretty critical. It's not, and I think it's probably not a thing that people think about at first when they're like, oh, what do we need for this team? But we were like, okay, this is a German show. We need a German-speaking host, obviously. We should have a German-speaking producer because the host needs a partner. But we also need a sound designer who can understand the words. Especially, I think, when you've got a case, something this emotional and sensitive, you want to make sure the music choices are appropriate, right? You can go wildly wrong with music choices.
Yeah.
And I think, I don't know, you've now developed a friendship or relationship with these women. I assume you feel pretty strongly that you want them to feel respected and this does justice to their story.
100%. And I really think it does. I'm so curious to hear their feedback.
Are you nervous?
A little bit, yeah.
Do you just let it come out? I'm also a journalist and host, so I go through these same emotional arcs, which are like, do I send it to them early? Do I wait? Do I reach out? What if I don't hear from them for a week? Do they hate it? It's very stressful.
Yeah. Yeah, we're definitely going to send it before.
With any kind of note, or will you just say like, hey, I'm really excited about this. I hope you guys...
I did. I've been in touch with them throughout and said, how amazing it was received, how many people cried. We had producers cry. But now I think, I'll send it to them and say, give me your honest feedback, but we can't make any changes.
And that's how it should be, I think, because it's important to point out that there is always fact-checking. And, of course, like, nothing goes in there that hasn't been vetted. So we know we're telling the truth and, we've done justice by the words that they said to you. But that doesn't ensure that they won't find some part of it uncomfortable, right? Just the reality of doing this work.
Yeah.
I guess as a last question, like, what is the narrative podcast world in Germany? Like, how would you compare it to, here, these kinds of shows are just part of what people listen to. There's so many of them. That's why Campside exists. Are they less common and popular there?
They're more quiet. That's why I was so happy with our sound design, because it's so beautiful and so rich and so varied. I think it's a little more quiet, a little bit more formal. But no, we always follow your suit and everything. And the narrative podcast market has definitely developed. And I think it's probably more narrative shows are being made in Germany still than here right now. I think the budgets are lower. I don't think the shows there are as expensive as they are here.
Well, let's hope this is our first #1 German hit.
That'd be amazing.
We'll find out very soon.
2 weeks, yeah.
All right, Antonia, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Josh.
Thanks again to Antonia and the rest of the Land Ohne Vater team, and thank you for listening to Inside the Tent. Don't forget to head over to joincampside.com to become a free member of the Campside community. That's joincampside.com.